I quickly wanted to introduce the two discussants of the presentation, which Tom Ferguson's with us already, and Anastasia Nesvetailova will hopefully join us any moment. I see her now actually come on. That's great. Welcome. So first off, Anastasia is the director of City Political Economy Research Center, City PERC at City University London, and she's specialized in a number of issues related to the money view, international political economy, finance and financial crises, regulation and governance. And she's been the author of numerous different books and articles, and I'll just mention two: Fragile Finance, Debt, Speculation and Crisis in the Age of Global Credit is one, and another that I'd like to mention is Financial Alchemy and Crisis, the Great Liquidity Illusion. Besides being the director of City PERC, she is also joined UNCTAD over the past, I think, 2 years now. We can hear her in a second how long she's been there. So she's currently on leave. So Anastasia will be the first discussant. The second discussant is Tom Ferguson, and you all know him. He's director of research at INET. He's professor emeritus at UMass Boston. And I just want to mention briefly related to today's conversation that correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but I believe that you were actually a student of Charlie Kindleberger. And so that's also why you're in a very good position to introduce Perry and the book project and how it connects up to the INET grant that Perry had received. And the final thing I'd like to say before I hand it over to Tom to make the formal introduction to Perry is, final thing I'd like to say is this very special welcome. I'm not sure if she's in the audience, but Sally Kindleberger has registered for the conference, so she hears the recording. Very warm welcome. I'm sure Perry will make a reference to her. He's been in touch with the family in doing his research, so it's very great to have them here at this event as well. So thank you very much for joining. So as I mentioned, Tom will say a very short word of introduction to Perry and the project, how it connects up to INET, yeah, looking forward to the conversation. Thank you, Tom.
All right, well, thanks, Jay. I think these sorts of things can quickly get unbearable. I mean, the point of this is to get Perry to talk, and then, we'll respond. I think I would simply say, first of all, just about Perry, that I think most of you know of him, and many of you will have been, I think, probably following his work for a long time. But he was a graduate of Harvard, and then got a master's in mathematical economics, econometrics at LSE, and then came back to Harvard, then taught at Barnard, and now at BU at the Pardee School. Now, I guess I confess, I never actually studied with Kindleberger, but I did take his last course, and he was a friend of mine, though we were not close. I thus am in the weird position of having a friend's book about another friend. And this may also, what's left, to say I saw the sun hit the Great Pyramid. I mean, I don't know. Anyway, I think the really great thing about Perry's work is that it did exactly what INET is or should be trying to do, which is develop genuinely new economic thinking that is at a very sophisticated level. I mean, monetary theory has been, there is an Egyptian quality to it at some very basic levels, things like loanable funds and so forth. And it seems you could see that even just the other day in the almost Dostoevskian like long interview that Ezra Klein had with Jason Furman. I mean, it was sort of like the unconscious of a particularly, sort of silly form of macroeconomics. But Perry's really developed this money view that really does, I think, help you greatly. Both it illuminates and you can use it as a tool to understand what's going on around you. And so when he said to me, I'm going to write a book on Kindleberger, I said, great, we would like this book for INET series with Cambridge University Press. And
whoops, Tom, you muted yourself for a second.
That was me, sorry.
Muted, I think. Okay, now I think I'm okay. And so look, let's hear from Perry. I've read the whole book in draft. It's a very good book. All of you will learn from it. I'll have more to say at the end.
Okay, so I guess that's my turn now. So you're all hearing me fine?
All good, Perry.
Okay.
You're good to go.
The let me move this out of the way. Okay. So yes, so I understand that I have about 40 minutes, and I'll try to even be shorter than that. I've got a lot of slides, but a lot of them are pictures, so they won't be, they'll be fast. And this is meant to whet your appetite for the book. And not to actually tell you everything that's in it, because it would be impossible. This is the title. So the book is definitely a biography of Kindleberger. You can see in the left-hand column there, these are the chapter titles. There's sort of 3 phases in his life that I divide the book into, so that if you are going to use this in your reading group, you might want to use 3 sessions, because actually there are 3 different careers, as a matter of fact. What I tried to, the reason I wrote this book, though, is to try to provide some perspective on the development of the global dollar system. And so you see in the right-hand column, the events of the global dollar system. Basically, Kindleberger I'm using as the arc of his life as a way of telling the story of the arc of the dollar system as well. The Fed was born in 1913, Charlie was born in 1910. And they came to maturity and they went through various crises. I could tell a number of different kinds of talks, because as the book came together, it's actually 3 narrative threads. There's this financial history that I mentioned, there's biography. Initially, it was just supposed to be a complement to the domestic, to New Lombard's Free, which some of you have read, which I was disappointed in immediately after it was published, because it made me realize this was a global financial crisis. And by focusing on the Fed, I lost some of the global dimension of it. So I thought I would write a parallel story about the biography of the dollar. And I did get one of the initial INET grants in 2010. And Kindleberger was not part of that original story, but then I discovered him and realized that there was a much more interesting kind of book to be written that would complete my money trilogy also. Just as I had used Fisher Black to tell the story of the rise of modern finance, I could use Kindleberger to tell the story of international money as a set of ideas as well. And what was I going to get out of it? What do I get out of any of these books? You know, it actually teaches me about monetary theory, that I wanted to get inside this mind, somebody who seemed to know something that I didn't know, and learn how to think about the world as he did. I didn't appreciate when I took this on that he was so interested in questions of the global South. But that proved to be particularly useful for me, particularly now that I've moved to Boston University. And maybe that's why they got interested in hiring me in the first place, because I'm trying to extend the money view to not only international economics, but in particular the problems of the global South. And that's what all my students at BU are interested in. So this was a good bridge for me. And I could give a talk, and I probably will be in the next year, you know, emphasizing any one of these threads. And however, the talk I'm going to give today is more emphasizing the biographical thread, because this group, YSI, is young scholars. And so thinking about how this man evolved and how he responded to the challenges of his life in a productive way, without getting depressed or angry, is, I think, a useful a useful, there's some lessons there. Let me tell you a little bit about how this book got written. As I said, it was originally this grant in 2010, which didn't really produce what I had hoped. When I saw what I was going to do, I began with archival work. All of Charlie's papers are at MIT, or not all of them. The really valuable ones are at the Truman Library. But that was a long time ago. That was the summer of 2013. When I do these works, I put a lot of energy into the very, very early work, the juvenilia. And because I want to know where this person came from, so that I can, and then I always write them chronologically, so that I don't prejudge where they're going. So it's always, to me, a little surprise, like which way they turned. That takes a long time, and it took a pretty long time for Charlie because he had these multiple careers, as I mentioned, and he had millions of people that he interacted with. In his 80th birthday party, which I'll come to at the end, there were 50 close friends giving talks about their personal relation with him. So that's a lot of stuff to keep track of, not to mention these three intertwining narrative threads. And Charlie's unusual reticence. Although he wrote an autobiography, it doesn't really tell you very much. And he wrote 31 books, 350 articles, so there's an enormous amount of material, but I'm determined to write a short book. You know, my books are, I have an iceberg theory, which is you wanna have only 10% of the material showing, but you want the reader to feel the 90% that's below the water. That's the challenge. So originally, when I got a grant for 3 years to write this book, which I only used 1 year of it, that didn't happen in 3 years, okay? And I originally proposed in 2014, it was gonna be a 6-chapter plan. Then it became 7, 8, 9, now it's 10 chapters. And I'm listing there the additional chapters. And basically in every section, one of the chapters became 2 chapters or it became 3 chapters. So, but anyway, it's only 260 pages long. So that's good. And it's not big pages and small print, so.
Harry, I think your microphone might be scraping on your beard a little bit.
That happened before, last year. Okay, how about this? Is this better?
Yeah, that
Okay.
seems good.
Yes, thank you for chiming in there. Last year, I spoke a little bit about Kindleberger as a money viewer, and I emphasized these first 2 points there, the balance of payments as a settlement constraint, and the exchange rate as an asset price formed in the dealer system. Now I know more about Charlie, and you'll see there's this issue so those are familiar ideas for anyone who's taken the MOOC. But when you get into really thinking about the way Charlie thought about the world, there's more dimensions of this. The long-term capital flows, the importance of long-term capital flows for global development, and the challenges those pose are very central to his thinking. And in particular, the political angle is there from the very beginning, which is not so much in the MOOC at all, okay? That because you're dealing with this dialectic between economics and politics, between nation states, there's not world government, so things are different when you're thinking about international money than when you're thinking about the monetary problems inside a country. And in particular, a theme that runs through his work eventually is that central bank cooperation is not enough. Central bank cooperation is very vital, but it's not enough. And I draw attention here to his book, World in Depression, which I understand your reading group read. There are 2 versions of this. The first one in 73, the second one in 86, and his conclusion for the world to be stabilized, there has to be a stabilizer, one stabilizer. And you notice that in each case, the last item in the list is sort of something a central bank might do, okay? And the prior items are something that requires other units of government to be involved. So that these are inherently political things. Stabilization is not a technocratic or not merely a technocratic thing. It's going to be a political thing, and it involves cooperation between countries, and that's what makes it challenging. Here I'm just showing you a picture. Mostly the work that I'm going to be talking about is the centerpiece of the book is really his time at MIT, which is really before he became really, I suppose, famous. outside. He became famous for this book, Manias, Panics, and Crashes, which was published in 1978 after he had taken mandatory retirement, and he went on to do other things you'll see. So this is just showing you the evolution of the dollar system from 1968 to more or less the present. A beautiful little paper by Ito and Macaulay. His work, Charlie's work, is about the extension of the dollar system to Europe mostly. Okay, that's mostly the story. But it has ramifications and implications for the subsequent extension of the dollar system to incorporate Asia, and in fact, particularly after the global crisis, the global South. So it's a key currency view. That is Charlie's view, which is a minority view, always has been a minority view, maybe always will be a minority view, but I think it is the correct view. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. The title, Money and Empire, is an homage to Marcello Di Cecco, beautiful book, which you should have in your reading group, about the sterling system in the 19th century. I'm talking about the dollar system. And what I think of money as a one word to stand in for this passage from from Charlie's book of 1987, that the model for the world should be the integrated financial market of a single country. So he's thinking that that's sort of where the world is going, and it seems to be. That's why I showed you that previous slide, the growth of the dollar system to over the extent of the globe. That model is, there's tendencies in the economic tendencies that lead toward that expansion, which we'll talk about, which I talk about in the book, but that is in conflict with a political need for local control, and the way he thinks that we can join those two things is by having leadership. The international economic and monetary system needs leadership. The US was a leader for a while, then it wasn't, maybe it is again. How do you have leadership in a world of multiple countries and multiple sovereignties? That's the challenge. So that's what empire is meant to stand in for, those two ideas. Now let me just say start walking you through the book, those three phases a little bit. Here, in a way, the bookends of the story I have to tell are highlighted there in red. International Short-Term Capital Movements was his PhD dissertation at Columbia University, written in period of hot money, and in the interwar period. The breakdown of the sterling system and the dollar system hadn't yet really been developed. I'm showing you there his main intellectual influences: Willis, Angel, Williams, Hansen. The book has little 5-page biographies of each of these people, and how they influenced him. I'm not going to say much about that. That would be in a history of thought talk. The other bookend is International Capital Movements. These are the Marshall Lectures that he gave in 1987, 50 years later, very consciously looking back to 50 years to his dissertation, and seeing where we come to from there. In the interim, the most important book, or the book he called his chef d'oeuvre, his masterpiece, Financial History of Western Europe, a lot of what I'm trying to do in chapter 9, okay, is really finish that book. Okay, that was a book that has been very difficult for people to come to grips with, and I think partly because you need to understand what Charlie was trying to do there, and understand how he came to that, and look at it through his eyes. So in my mind, that's actually one of the major contributions of my book, is to translate financial history of Western Europe, and to show that this is actually his treatise. This is his major treatise on money. And the main story that he tells there, as I argue, is that the story of this financial history is a story of the Darwinian coevolution of this integrated world market, that's the money part, with an international lender of last resort, that they grow together, that the international lender of last resort is crucial to stabilization of this, and therefore creation of this world market. And the creation of this world market requires the constant evolution of the international lender of last resort as it grows. That's the drama of financial history of Western Europe. that would be the topic for a different talk if I was telling the story about the evolution of the world financial system. But mostly I want to talk about his life. But you will see these themes will come in as we proceed. I could talk about all of this, but then we'd be here for several days. So let me just show you some things, and some things that are not in the book. None of these pictures, by the way, that I'm going to show you are in the book. I wanted the book to be cheap for people to buy. And maybe I'll create a website or something with some of these pictures. So I start, as I say, with his birth, okay, and his childhood, his Republican upbringing by a Republican lawyer in New York City, his Jamestown summers, it's a resort off the coast of Rhode Island, went to boarding school at Kent School, was a classics sort of specialist there, not a very good athlete, but he managed teams when he couldn't play, went to UPenn because that's where his father went. And that's where he discovered international economics. His plan in 1932 was to graduate early, marry his sweetheart, and get a job at the Fed. And none of that worked. And not just because of the Great Depression. It turned out, as he himself says, that Carolyn Thompson had other ideas, and so did the Fed. So he had to have another plan. And his other plan was to get a PhD in economics at Columbia University. And 4 years later, he married Sarah Miles, and he got a job at the Fed, the New York Fed. And proceeded with his life. Here's some pictures. So this is him. This is Charlie Kindleberger, all three of these. And if Sally is here, thank you for giving me these pictures. So here's her father as a choir boy in Flushing, Queens. The middle picture is a picture of him at the Kent School when he group picture of the people on the Kent News, and the one on the right, he was at Penn, and he actually worked his way up to alternate for the 8-man crew. So that was a victory. This is him rowing actually on the Charles River at the head of the Charles. It's a picture from the Crimson, as a matter of fact. So you can see his childhood. After getting his PhD, or even as he was getting his PhD, he was hired at the New York Fed, and worked there for a while, and then went. It was supposed to be 3 years at the Bank of International Settlements, but Hitler invaded France and the fall of Paris. So he came home and worked for the Board of Governors for a while. And then his war service, he was a very, very senior intelligence officer in London, cleared for ultra, got a Bronze Star. And after the war in the State Department, he was the key person organizing the legislation for the Marshall Plan. He was also the chief of the German and Austrian division, which was reconstructing Germany after the war. So he was a civil servant. He was a government economist for 12 years. You can see there, from 1936 to 1948. This is his formative period. Here's 3 pictures from that period. The first one is Davos, skiing in Davos when he was at the BIS in Basel. And the second one is in London when this is a formal picture when he was in the OSS and trying to figure out how to take apart the German economy by aerial bombardment. And the third is a picture, you see how happy he is there. This is November, right before the Battle of the Bulge, when he thought the war was won and everyone is celebrating, but the war wasn't quite won yet. And so it took him a while to get home. And when he did get home, he had to give up 3 months of accumulated vacation because he had to start at the State Department right away. So he's happy here, not knowing what's about to come. Here he is at the State Department, and he's happy again. This I take to be, I don't know who any of these other people are. I would like to identify them, but it looks like something to promote the Marshall Plan. 3% from the US means 6% for Europe. So that's him second from the left. So he was a very successful government economist, a very successful and very important government economist, well before he started in academia. And in his autobiography, he tells you that these are his heroes, the great men. Alan Sproul, that was New York Fed. Omar Bradley, that was World War II. William Clayton and George Marshall, this is the State Department. And his sort of demigods were these economists who he worked with in these places, Emile Dupre, Alvin Hansen, Edward Mason, Willard Thorpe. He dedicates his last 2 books, first to the great men and then to the economists. So these were his heroes. He came to academia in 1948, fully formed, okay, with this life behind him. And he started a new life when he moved to MIT. This is a picture of approximately the time when he joined MIT. I think probably it was taken as a promo for his 1950 book, The Dollar Shortage. So he's now looking more serious and academic here. The plan at Harvard, I think it's important to appreciate. It's not at Harvard, at MIT. As I've reconstructed it, I think his plan was to use MIT as a base to continue doing the kind of work that he had been doing in the State Department and also for the German Reconstruction and also Reconstruction of Europe, which he saw as standing with one foot in 2 worlds, the practitioner world of the New York Fed and the academic world. And he didn't really want to be in either one of these worlds completely. Charles Coombs, who basically ran the swap lines, the dollar swap lines from the New York Fed, is a kind of hero of his, but a narrow central banker type, okay, not seeing the bigger picture. Gottfried Habler, down the river at Harvard, he takes as a sort of who's saying we don't need the Marshall Plan, said Gottfried Habler. We need to stop the inflation, control the exchange rate, let markets do their thing. Charles Kindleberger thought that was never going to work, and so his first book, The Dollar Shortage, is an academic defense of the Marshall Plan. Okay, so it's an attempt to use academic arguments to justify this very strong government intervention because of the prevalence of structural disequilibrium. You know, that markets aren't going to work because they don't exist here. This is a post-war period. It's a shambles. We have to reconstruct this thing on purpose. That's what this book is about. So that's part of his plan, to have one foot in both of those worlds. And I particularly draw attention of this group to this because one of the things I like about the Money View Symposium is that it has a foot in both of these worlds, and that we're trying to foster that conversation between those worlds. And so immediately after me, you'll hear, and tomorrow you'll hear from Credit Suisse, and I think that's Charlie would like that. That was part of the plan. The second idea that he had, because he had been in the State Department, was that you can't really separate economic equilibrium from political equilibrium. And by political equilibrium, he means basically political peace, you know, that equilibrium distribution of income and so forth. So he tried to write some articles when he first came to MIT, trying to join political science and economics, suggest some ways of doing that. The first one was rejected by the QJE. I suspect that Haberler may have had a hand in that. And the second one was accepted by the JPE. So he had that idea. I want to mention that here at the beginning because he comes back to that idea later in life. And so notice that it's there right at the beginning as part of his plan. Here's the third dimension of the plan. This is maybe looking forward more, but he's not, at the time he came to MIT in 1948, the sort of division of the armies, monetarism versus Keynesianism, they weren't quite established, okay? But as they became established, he was sort of in neither real camp, okay? He was more monetary than the Keynesians, certainly, and more Keynesian than the monetarists, meaning interventionists. And so he was trying to a third way, okay, and you'll see later on in life him trying to more explicitly separate himself from both of these orthodoxies and try to find a dialectical synthesis that moves forward. He's also an American institutionalist because of where he comes from. And so he thinks of the economic system as being in process of Darwinian institutional evolution. And war is a particularly important hothouse. He has reason to know that, that World War I was totally crucial for the creation of the Federal Reserve System as a unified system inside the United States. I talk about that in the book. I'm not going to say anything about that, but World War II, totally crucial for creation of the world dollar system, which was, there was attempts to cobble this together a little bit before the war with the tripartite agreement of 1936, but World War II made it real. And all that Bretton Woods was doing was sort of blessing that, that consequence of the war. And the third, going beyond monetarism and Keynesianism, is that he's definitely an internationalist, teaching cosmopolitanism, always thinking of the world as a whole, thinking of the Bank for International Settlements as the central bank for the central banks of the North, okay, and the IMF as being kind of extending this dollar system to the periphery. That's his image of the institutional basis of the post-war system. And making that work, putting that all together, making that coherent. I think that's a pretty unique vision at that time. And looking at the world through that perspective, instead of through the kind of rosy multilateral lens of Bretton Woods, this is how he saw the world. Key currency, dollar world, organized around these key institutions. This was his plan, I think. Some of this may be more implicit than explicit. And events disrupted this plan. So this is where you start to see the personality. In 1951, he lost his security clearance. This is a guy who had been cleared for ultra, who was one of the top intelligence officers during the war. And he got swept up in the McCarthy witch hunt. And so he couldn't do this practitioner academic thing because he couldn't do any government work at all. That was a huge setback for his intellectual development, and explains why he turned his hand to writing textbooks, international economics in 1953, economic development in 1958. I tell the story of those textbooks in the book. It also made him shift to economic history in a way that instead of getting data from interacting with the government, he starts to look into economic historians. The Harvard Center for National Affairs becomes his intellectual community instead of the MIT Center for International Studies. You had to have a security clearance for the center because the CIA gave them money. So he was blocked out of the Center of Social Science in MIT, and so he accommodates to that and writes these books, Economic Growth in France and Britain, for example, in 1964. And you see him there basically using the skills that he had developed during the war as an intelligence analyst, making sense of raw data. So he was never an economic historian in the sense that he went to archives and dug up new facts. He was an intelligence analyst who took the raw facts dug up by other people and spun them into a narrative in order to tell the generals where the Germans are building their airplanes and therefore where you should bomb. That is the same kind of approach that he's using when he is doing economic history. So events disrupt the plan, and he adjusts the plan. Okay. Here's actually the first page of his FBI report. This is the one which he got from the Freedom of Information Act, and you can sort of see the first line there. I've tried to increase the contrast. Employment at Treasury Department, June 29, 1936 to September 28, 1936. That was Harry Dexter White. Okay, it was a summer job before he went to the Board of Governors. That's how he got on the radar screen of the FBI. Okay, and once he was on that radar screen, he was being followed. And these are the three strikes against him that made him lose his security clearance: that he had relations with Frank Coe and Harry Dexter White, that some guy who he didn't even know named David Wall had indicated that he was a helpful person when he was in the State Department, and he was friends with Robert T. Miller, who was the year ahead of him at the Kent School. And that's what messed him. That's what made him lose his clearance. I tell more about that in the book. But that wasn't the last thing that disrupted his plan. I actually think that Triffin, publication in 1957 of Europe and the Money Muddle and the whole Triffin dilemma thing that many of you have heard of, okay, he really didn't think that had much to offer, but because it became such a public frame that people used to think about the problems of the dollar system, he felt he had to respond to it. So Triffin's Europe and the Money Muddle, you can see 10 years later, Europe and the Dollar, this is a collection of essays that Charlie writes, is kind of an attempt to try to steer people in the right direction, as he sees, away from Triffin. The Dollar and World Liquidity, this famous economist article that he wrote with Emile Dupre and Walter Salant, is an attempt to influence the general public. Measuring equilibrium, this is another attempt to influence policy people. It didn't really work. And so he gives up on it, basically, but it was a distraction. He couldn't be the scholar he wanted to be because there are these disputes happening in the 60s. Another event, which maybe Tom will have something to say about, that disrupted the plan, I think, is MIT's big push in about 1966, to become the leading economics department in the world. When he was hired in 1948, there wasn't much of a department there at all. It was really just Samuelson had been hired. He'd written his famous undergraduate textbook. Solo was hired the year after him. So it was a different department that he was hired into, and it changed. Okay, this idea of policy relevance with rigor, which meant Samuelson's neoclassical synthesis plus Solo's growth model plus Modigliani's monetary policy activism. Modigliani came in 1962. Meant that MIT increasingly became a kind of place that wasn't really that amenable to the kind of work that Charlie did. But Guadi was appointed in 1968. That meant that he wasn't going to that Charlie wasn't teaching international trade anymore. Okay, Dornbusch was hired in 1975. He took over the international monetary stuff, and then in 1976 he faced mandatory retirement. They did a festa for him in 1971, which is more or less saying goodbye to him. So he was a grand old man, at 60. It's fun to study a man who was born in 1910 because you can always tell how old he is. Just subtract 10 from whatever he's writing. So he was 19. He was 60. I'm 60, a little bit older than 60. So I know I don't feel washed up, and I wouldn't like my colleagues telling me time to leave. Okay, but he was a member of the team, and he tried to find something else to do. He was chairman of the faculty. He thought about becoming a dean or a president. He took a leave in order to get away from the craziness of the 60s. And then when he came back, he decided that he didn't want to be a dean or a president. He wanted to be a scholar. So that was a disruption, MIT's thing. Another disruption, a third disruption, I guess this is now we're up to 4, is this incredible academic enthusiasm that grew up in the late 60s for flexible exchange rates, including by people who called themselves Keynesians, like Harry Johnson, who wrote the case for flexible exchange rates, and Nixon's then devaluation in August 1971. So Charlie wrote the case for fixed exchange rates. Remember, he's a key currency guy, and he thinks fixed exchange rates are kind of a way of having international money that is useful. Just the advantages of money in the United States, having a unified monetary system, are just the same as the advantages of a fixed exchange rate system globally. So he's pretty disappointed about that. He tries to fight against this and gets all swept up in this. I think this book, International Money, beautiful book, is much of those things are written trying to continually make these points to other audiences. He feels obliged after Nixon basically destroys the fixed exchange rate system in August 1971 to keep getting pulled back into these debates. And so he can't do the scholarly work that he really wanted to do. Only really, so now he finally, after those distractions, here's what he does. He becomes an economic historian or a historical economist. This is showing him in about 1971 when he wrote World in Depression. wasn't published until 1973. There's a sense that he's putting all this academic dispute behind him, and now he's just going to be a scholar. And this is where he wrote his books, in this chicken coop in the backyard of his house. You can see the beehives. He was an amateur beekeeper there to the right. And then after he wrote, he went on the road, and you can see him, giving on the right-hand panel. I like the juxtaposition of these two, showing this dapper man giving keynote addresses around the world, and having a life outside of MIT. He's now independent. He doesn't have to be a member of that team. So he's recommitted, but short on time. So this is when he writes World in Depression, but really he is trying to do this comparative political economy project, which he tried to start back in 1950, okay? He's restarting this research program, and I'm showing some of the key texts of that. And then all of a sudden, opportunity knocks. So this is now not something disrupting his plan, but something that's offering to support his plan. Okay, that he gets elected to the AEA presidency. In 1984. He's 74 years old, and he's supposed to be off the shelf now, or on the shelf, I guess. And he takes that opportunity to very publicly, his speech as a president was international public goods without international government, which is exactly the problem he was dealing with in 1950. And that leads to him getting invited to give the Marshall Lectures and several other books, International Economic Order, Historical Economics. These are all, he gets invited to collect his essays. So he takes advantage of that. Here's a picture of him as AEA president. And this picture is, there's a version of this picture that's on the cover of the autobiography that is cropped more than this. Okay, I wanted to show the larger picture. If you look over his left shoulder, i.e. to your right, you can see a little book on his shelf there. Can It Happen Again? Can you see that book? Okay, that's Minsky. So we can talk about some of the story in the book is about the relationship between Minsky and Kindleberger. That would maybe be for another talk. But I thought it was, obviously this is posed. He knew that was going to be behind him in that picture. That could be something interesting to look into. So he is riding very high in 1984, and events disrupted that plan. And these are now personal events, that his wife had a stroke in 1986, and so they had to sell the Lincoln house and move into Brookhaven, assisted living place to the north of Boston here, and that was very disruptive. He finished his autobiography in a huge rush just before moving into Brookhaven, which is why it's so unsatisfactory, really. But gradually, once he got settled there, started to get back into doing some intellectual work. Mariners and Markets was the first toe in the water, and then this big project, World Economic Primacy. And then I'm showing in red, this is the last book that he ever published. It's a collection of his greatest hits, which he calls Comparative Political Economy, a retrospective. So this is telling you that his own self-identity at the end of his life was that he was doing comparative political economy. Here's just some, the book has an epigram in front of every chapter. Here's a few of them. I don't think actually I use this one as an epigram. Don't dig in, keep adjusting. But I do think that is his sort of lifestyle. That when you get a shock, adjust to it. You need to bend, you need to change. He got a lot of shocks in his life, and is a role model, I think, for how to continue doing and wind up doing what you plan to do, even when you were not able to follow the specific path that you had in mind. So so just maybe 2 or 3 minutes here at the end, some themes that that are raised by this story. One question: what is an economist? Are economists modelers? Is that what economics is? Mathematical or statistical? This sort of image that the MIT style. Is an economist a policy advocate, a hired gun? That's the sort of Triffin, maybe, version. An academic career is proving your manhood by publishing. That's what he would say. Proving your manhood by publishing in top journals. You know, he loved publishing in festschrifts because there you don't have to deal with referees. And a public ideologue, an apologist for the state or the market. We could talk about his relationship and tussles with Milton Friedman, for example. His own image of what is an economist is a scholar. That's who he was, and a scholar as an intelligence analyst. The style, his way of being an economist was this particular intelligence analyst style, and you can see it really in all of his work. Not that any one of these is a wrong way. There are lots of ways, but there are different ways of being an economist, and they contribute different things. Another thing we might that is raised by this story that I'm telling is what is economics, okay? And in fact, what is the economy? I want to emphasize that his intellectual formation is in American institutionalism, empiricism, a deeply empiricist person, okay? That he believes in markets, but he looks out in the world and sees the prevalence of structural disequilibrium, and that you need to understand that, particularly in the global South, as a matter of fact. So when markets don't work, don't use markets. That was his theory, okay? That if markets aren't working, you need government. He had a vacuum theory of government, not market failure, view, but things that markets aren't doing, government needs to do. That the way, that instead of solo growth model, you have this Darwinian evolution imagination of development and growth muddling through, and that the economic system is fundamentally international. That thinking of national economic stabilization as the main goal is too narrow. The centrality of the development of the global South for the success of the global North. These are themes throughout his life. War as a hothouse for institutional development, I mentioned that before, but peacetime instability as a driver of institutional evolution. There's sort of two kinds of instability that he emphasizes. One is financial instability, destabilizing speculation, but another one is political instability, pluralism versus centralism. So there's a seesaw that is driving institutional development in peacetime. He emphasized that instability is stabilizing. That is to say that when people don't like instability, and so when the seesaw goes too far on one side, there's an institutional reaction to try to stabilize this system. In a way, that's the opposite side of Minsky, right? Who said stability is destabilizing. Maybe that's just what different ways of different emphases, but they're compatible with each other, I think. Here he is at 80 years old. One of the first times that I told you he moved into this retirement community. One of the first trips he was able to make after settling in there was for this party at the Terrace Restaurant at Columbia University, which is where, of course, he got his PhD. This group of 50 friends took him out to dinner at the Terrace Restaurant, and they feted him and told him what a wonderful person he was. And here's a picture from that time. And at 80 years old, what a life. That's my story.
Thank you, Perry. Thank you very much for this great narration of a great life. I think we're all going to appreciate the book very much. I think we can go right into the comments from our discussants. We'll start with Anastasia. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Perry. Thank you everybody for accommodating also time zones and schedules. Really appreciate it. It's not only, these introductions usually start with it's an honor. It's more than an honor. It's almost emotional because I actually discovered Perry for myself as I was writing my PhD on Minsky. Nobody was writing on Minsky at the time. And his article, it was the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organization. It probably was the only intellectual biography of Minsky at the time. I think it was 1999. And it was an amazing story of financial theory, the evolution of financial system, the evolution of theory through the life of a scholar that at that time wasn't particularly known. And that's how I eventually came to know Perry personally. So it's I discovered Kindleberger, I have to say, probably a little bit later than Minsky himself, but it's amazing to be able to speak to the person who brought Minsky closer to me at the time, and it was very important. The minute Perry mentioned that he's writing the biography, I knew that this is definitely the history I would like to read. I thought about perhaps there should be a movie about that too, especially now that he is confirmed as a spy who lost his clearance in McCarthyism time. I think, Perry, you should, this is your opportunity for a script, copyright for a thriller, or maybe a Netflix series. It's really anything goes. But more content-wise, I kept reading and listening today, of course, looking for parallels in what you call either, keeping two hands or two legs in two big fields, politics and economics. And of course, he was an empiricist. But to me, he's clearly a political economist and an international political economist at that, because he actually didn't bother to separate or made an effort. Probably it was quite difficult for him at the time to make that effort not to separate the two fields. In contrast to Minsky, who did. Minsky was very careful, and I think it was you who told me, or maybe it was Gary Dimsky who told me that personally for Minsky, for his career at the time, it would be an academic or professional suicide to talk about more coherently, more systemically about labor markets or the role of the state. So he stuck to the financial system as a very safe ground. Kindleberger clearly had a very different and probably privileged or courageous position to unite the two. So as a professor of IR or political economy, I teach students his hegemonic stability theory. This is how he is known without his narrative of financial crisis or cycle. And hegemonic stability theory is is foundational in any scholarship on political science and especially international relations. And it's very much about the equilibrium and the costs of that equilibrium, the structural equilibrium that a hegemonic state, the leadership, has to maintain after the breakout of the war. And clearly the leader has to maintain the costs of that order. It's the central pillar of international relations as a discipline, and the discipline itself also evolved very much in parallel to the story of your book. It's a discipline that everybody. It started in the early 40s, and it's really a pathways to answer how to avoid war, how to try to live in peace with one another, how to compete, how to collaborate, how to share, and acknowledging the problems. But the main message of international relations as an academic discipline is really to avoid a repetition of the war. Just like for Minsky, it was the avoidance of Great Depression, and probably for Kindleberger as well. Whereas as a financial historian, he came to me through Minsky. And this is one of the more specific questions I wanted to raise with you, because in the book, of course, I noticed references to Minsky and their relationship and the critique and the almost mirror image. But then at the time, I think it was in Manias, Panics and Crashes, Kindleberger himself cites a Minsky-Kindleberger hypothesis of financial crises. This is where he extended the insular model of a national economy, of a closed economy that Minsky developed, kind of to his international system. With some curiosity now, I understand that this is actually the only place I found the reference to Minsky-Kindleberger hypothesis. Minsky himself I don't think he ever mentioned that, and it didn't assume white currency. Do you have any insight on that? Was it an ego kind of thing at the time? It was one of the later publications of Kindleberger, and is it his answer to Minsky to say, yeah, okay with your disequilibrium? And structural instability, but you clearly need to pay attention to the international order. It was a mirror image. It was literally a copycat of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, but slightly adjusted to international order. And I have to say, Minsky then, when he was writing his late articles in the 90s, already after the collapse of the Soviet Union, he kind of was moved on to discuss some international context and analyze the consequences. He didn't mention Kindleberg. So if you have any insight on the personal academic relationship of that, that would be nice. And now with my, it's not that the UNCTAD had, but it came actually yesterday or the day before. I was participating in a session discussing world economic trends, what is happening to inflation, how does the action of the Fed how does it affect the financial markets? And then in the discussion area of the Zoom program, one of the country delegates was asking, what is the best way today to measure monetary mass? Or maybe he mentioned money supply. And of course, Kindlebergers, the 11 categories of M1, M2, M3 of monetary aggregates came to my mind. I didn't have time to speak about that. But maybe it's unfair. You're not Kindleberger, but you by now you know him intimately. What would he say about the mess today? His political and economic, I'm not calling it model, but vision, are visions of order. He likes this very stabilized political structure with the center, costs shared, very assigned roles to post-war architecture. And of course, the mission of that architecture was to be stable, to ensure stability. Very similarly, you have just shown that in his dollar system, it's the very same kind of core periphery architecture. There is dollar, it's international currency, somebody is assuming the cost of managing it, and there is institutional relationship between the BIS for the core and let's say the IMF for the periphery. We have moved somewhat in more messy context away from that time and away from that ambition. There's been political transformation of political authority. It is being fragmented, and of course there are financial innovations that kind of augment or undermine or transform the financial system. What would he say today? Would he even say it doesn't actually matter anymore? Because probably Minsky would say it doesn't matter what you call money, you just need to to look at the institutional mechanisms and creditworthiness of the parties. Would Kindleberger have a very different view of how to solve the post-COVID, as you said, how to use the opportunity to redraft something that didn't work during COVID, and markets didn't work during COVID. What worked was the state. It was very much a public provision for economy or market services. What would he say today? And finally, and this is my last comment, if you were very briefly to say what was a political economic system or an economic system to Kindleberger, what would it be? Just a definition of system. But the two previous questions are more interesting to me personally. So I'm using my role as a discussant to tease out something out. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and I'm looking forward also to illustrations. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for those comments. I think we're first going to hear from Tom before we allow Perry to respond. So Tom, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. It was a great talk, Perry, and thank you, Anastasia. I think I would like to address just a few issues, but do them very directly. Now, yeah, as Jay suggested, I have a somewhat different situation. I wasn't Kindleberger's student. When I took my job at MIT, I saw that he was teaching actually European financial history. And I said to myself, I should take this course. So I did. I just sat in on it. It was no trouble, and soon we began talking. And I was never close to Charlie, as close as some of the students like Steve McGee, who are very close friends of mine. But we would talk and discuss. And the thing that struck me even at the time, I just walked in. I'm not claiming to have been innocent, even when I walked in to MIT for the first time. But you could see that, yeah, his colleagues in economics really didn't like him. And the students picked up on that. There were only 1 or 2 students who sat in on that course from the graduate program. And my memory is maybe one of them's gone. It's a long time ago. And there were a couple undergraduates. There was me, and then 1 or 2 visitors would come through. It was, I thought, an extremely instructive and interesting. It came out, given the time thing, it has to have been part of his writing that book there. But when I talked to Kindleberger, as Perry suggests, yeah, you sure got a cosmopolitan perspective, highly educated, but also a point I would emphasize, it's in Perry's book very plainly, but look, this guy's an honest man in a system that was fairly dishonest. And I want to be perfectly straightforward about this. And he's not the only, Charlie Kindleberger wasn't the only MIT person I became close to. Another one was Francis Bator at the end of his life, who was the deputy director of that Center for International Affairs at MIT. And then became the Deputy National Security Advisor of the United States, and did also the negotiations over nuclear stuff. And he lived around the corner from me for the last 5 or 7 years of his life. And so we would talk a lot. The first thing I'll say is Francis was a great economist, but he did not appreciate Kindleberger at all. They just, and I heard plenty about his other colleagues' attitudes too. When you really got the depths of the dislike of Charlie's thing, an unsympathetic being like myself would say it bordered on the irrational. But it's not, you can explain it though. And I want to talk just a bit about it. I want to come back first of all to that security clearance issue. I mean, the published economic histories about MIT don't deal with this. I said this a few years ago where some of the people writing these were in the audience. I'm going to repeat it. I'll eventually maybe make it in public. The fact is, yeah, we all know that Samuelson was having to show drafts of his textbook to trustees, which is a crazy situation. But Bator barely got cleared to be the deputy director of the center there for international affairs. Why? Because James Angleton, if you know anything about the history of post-war America, you will understand the gravity of what I'm telling you. Angleton had decided that he was really a Russian agent or couldn't be trusted. The way Bator beat that was his father had worked in the interwar period with the Dulles brothers, so he could go to the head of the agency, did, and got cleared. That tells you how crazy the situation is. That stuff that was not a situation of 47 or 48. It kept right on going. It is a fact, which I learned from Bator. I'm sure the documents exist too on that briefly Walt Rostow, of all possible people, lost his security clearance. That's coming, so I was told. I have no independent way of verifying this because Dean Rusk hated him and was trying to keep him out of the Kennedy administration. As we all know, he failed on that one. Now, the significance of this is the intellectual deep freeze at precisely the points where it really matters. Now, if you look at the generation that Kindleberger was part of, whether they're in international relations or economics or history, they almost all share the view that, well, the United States made a disastrous decision not to join the League of Nations, that cooperation internationally was absolutely vital. And then if you didn't do that, terrible things happened, like World War II. And so they all drew the lesson from that afterward. Well, we need multilateral or international organizations. And, the US did a couple of those. The International Trade Organization failed, but they got, that got the generalized system, got that GATT business, did succeed. And, with the Cold War broke out, that wasn't on their original plan. It was on a lot of other people's plans, including Will Clayton, who Charlie, I think, quite mistakenly saw as a villain, as a hero. But the point is, okay, the official story was multilateralism and if you like, globalism in that specific sense, though globalism tends to acquire more meanings as we go on there. But people had a funny time at every point putting politics and economics together. It's not an accident that those two papers on politics and economics that Perry cites, they're in the very early 50s. Then it stops. He comes back to that at the end of his life when the climate has thawed a bit. One could go on about this, but the bottom line on this is it just stops serious thinking about politics and economics. Just not Charlie Kindleberger, but hundreds of Americans and many academics lost positions, jobs, etc. Finding a way talk about politics and economics was a huge headache. I will not discuss my own case, which was sitting on the web for years in some of Noam Chomsky's books. No reason to do that. But Charlie, you could have a reasonable discussion with, but he never carried that discussion any further. I mean, in particular, there's a problem with just being an intelligence analyst, and you all know what it is. It's like eventually you can try to get documents. Nobody did that. When I was sitting at MIT working there on that faculty, I would go into the Harvard Business School and look at their business records. I was the only person in that place doing it. And to this day, it's a somewhat strange situation. The result is my slogan has for many years been America's the dark continent. I mean, we know more about stuff in Brazil, in the interior of the Amazon, than we know about power in the United States. Now, where does this get sticky? Well, if you have as Charlie began to sort of backfill exactly as Perry suggests, like he can go do economic history, and yes, he can use it to get material. He is somewhat, I think he finds it very difficult to analyze what's going on in the United States and elsewhere. Like I was around, so I know he thought the world was going to hell in a handbasket as the Bretton Woods system collapsed, and that international cooperation was broken. And they also thought for a while that the dollar system was doomed. Now we all know what happened. It got reborn like Phoenix later. Now, by that time, the problem of understanding it got superseded. He had translated discussions about, if you like, imperialism, got refashioned in the language of neoclassical economic theory, really an application of Olson, the public goods thing, to international relations. And that was a pretty interesting move because, first of all, it does genuinely illuminate a whole bunch of things. It also tends to unfortunately make you lose sight of a lot of important things. You could think of it as a justification for just being a hegemon, which it partly was, but it also blinded people to a lot of stuff. Charlie encountered this when his student Stephen Heimer wrote that first big book on the multinational corporation, and MIT wouldn't print it in their series. His own colleagues wouldn't print it. That's a big theme we could go on with forever. But my point is simply, he had problems all his life with the interaction of politics and economics. The Depression book, I think, suffers from that. It's good where the trigger is obviously financial and economics. I mean, Charlie really Perry in the book is quite good on discussing like what's in Kindleberger that's not in the standard economic histories, particularly the types that were written in the 70s and 80s there. Like the discussion of commodity markets and that worldwide collapse of those. On the other hand, Charlie sort of missed the story of the big story of 1931, which is really a party politics story in Germany that leads to a breakdown of the international system. The whole fairy tale about how the Creditanstalt collapsed the thing. I mean, that's, there was more gold in the Reichsbank at the end of May in 1931 than there was at the start. In other words, after the thing collapsed. It's a party politics story. And to this day, nobody has done a lot really to clarify that, with the single exception of DeCecco, actually, who never bought into the nearly the, let us say, one-eyed man is king story of international relations and or politics, but not both, and economics. I mean, that's, however, a large theme, and I'm out of time. The point I would like to make, though, is that Charlie didn't try to say he didn't know Harry Dexter White, which is, of course, insane, since White was one of the principal architects of Bretton Woods. There's a piece on the INET website even yesterday or a couple days ago by Jim Broughton, their official historian of that operation for a long time, on this point. And Kindleberger wouldn't be pushed around by people who kept trying to tell him to do stuff for his own advantage. I remember when he told me a very famous colleague of mine had just thrown away data rather than write the truth about international trade and lobbying in Congress. I remember that very well. But on the other hand, you can get deformed in environments just from having to sort of steer clear of, if you like, sides or something that would just sweep you away as you turn a corner. And in that sense, I think Kindleberger's legacy is unfinished. It could be usefully picked up. But you won't, I think, get too far without trying to seriously look much more closely at the interactions between politics and economics in international political economy. An intelligent analyst story is the second best way of proceeding. It's what you do when you can't get documents, web pages, web emails and things like that. Not for nothing did, I guess, as you probably all read, Donald Trump was apparently flushing down the toilet pieces of his administration's history just as he left the White House. On this happy note, I'll quit. Everybody ought to read the book. It's very good, very important.
Well, Perry, you got quite a few things to respond to. So why don't we go with you for a couple of minutes, and if we have time, we'll take one or two questions from the audience before we go for a break.
I know we want to have a break because Zoltan is coming at 3:30. Is that right?
That's right. So I think we should go for another 10 or 12 minutes max, so we give ourselves 5 minutes for a break.
Okay. And so let me also say that I will be at the liquidity happy hour. Okay. So if there is further conversation, I'm happy to continue there. Let me just maybe say a few things about. It's a longer conversation that Anastasia has suggested here, but let me at least get one side started here. She asks about the relationship between Minsky and Kindleberger. It is Kindleberger in a number of places actually gives Minsky credit for bringing his attention to financial instability. As far as I can figure out, he never heard of Minsky until he was writing Manias, Panics, and Crashes, and somebody told him about Minsky, and so he looked into it. Okay, so it was, and in Manias, Panics, and Crashes, he does say that he is validating the Minsky model. Okay, but they don't have the same model. It's not correct to say that he's a copycat of Minsky. And I talk quite specifically about the difference. Minsky is really about American business cycles. It's about business credit. It's about fluctuations of investment and corporate profits. Whereas what what Kindleberger likes about Minsky is that he's like the sole surviving representative of an older tradition that emphasized credit instability. the older tradition that in fact he grew up on in Columbia, at Columbia. So he recognizes, oh, here's somebody who actually has sort of survived, and he has a model, and he has some math and stuff. And so he kind of made common cause with Minsky. I think that's what I would say. He always emphasized, oh, Minsky says there's a displacement and then there's a financial. Minsky never said such a thing, right? So he's actually giving Minsky credit for his own work, okay? Because he sees Minsky as somebody who has more theoretical chops or something like that. Charlie's story is completely international, and the capital flows between countries are the key to the whole thing, the transmission of financial cycles internationally. But there's a whole bunch about this in the book. I would have to. I could write a whole paper just on that Minsky stuff, but you'll see in the footnotes and so forth. You can tease it all out. They were friends, but he didn't. And there was an important conference in 1981 at MIT in which they were back and forth. They were talking about the interwar period. And Charlie actually was editor of a book in which Minsky's hypothesis was the first chapter. I think it's actually the best article that Minsky ever wrote to really summarize what his whole theory is. And so he was a supporter of Minsky. In fact, that's maybe the main point. And there's more to that. There's more to that story. Hegemonic stability theory. I just want to put this one little idea here. Charlie had a kind of love-hate relationship with that. He never used the word hegemon. Okay, he only used the word leader, and it was he was very careful about that. The political scientists took it over, and he had an uneasy relationship with that. He definitely did not think that it was, he really thought that there's these forces of instability that always are springing forth and that's okay, that's how the system develops. You then have to manage them. So that's, I think, not quite what the hegemonic stability theory is, but again, that's a longer conversation. What would he say about today? I think he would definitely say exactly what you said, okay, that what we're in a post-war transition from war finance to peace finance, okay, and that's a rocky thing. That's a difficult transition to make. But being aware that that's what you're doing is helpful, that you're not trying to stabilize a business cycle or something like that. You're trying to transition from war finance to peace finance. And that's an institutional problem. Okay, not a technocratic problem, and it's a political problem as well, as we're seeing with the strikes at Starbucks and all this. You know, we're not going back to status quo ante, and so this is a period like post World War II. I think he would say. So for Tom, I learned some things from what you said. We've talked about this. I think that's.
Charging is done.
I'm sorry. Did I do something wrong? Did it turn off?
No, somebody has their mic on. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
I'll mention.
There's a lot in what you said, and I want to think about it. It is definitely right that the dominant sort of discourse is all about multilateralism. That's what Bretton Woods was, and so forth. Key currency, okay, suggests that multilateralism is definitely not going to work in money. Okay, that it is a key currency world, and it's a dollar world. And the question is that enough? Is that enough sort of global stuff to hold the world together? And it's not. It's not. The cooperation of central bankers, which Charlie knew extremely well because of his time at the New York Fed and at the BIS, the swap lines that are holding the system together in a crisis, you know, only buy time for the politicians to do the right thing. And if they don't do the right thing, the crisis will come anyway. Okay, so the political challenge is there, and imagining that all sovereigns are equal, you know, it's a dollar system is what it is. It's one world, he would keep saying. One world, one money market, one capital market. It's not 150. And that creates political challenges. He did think the world was going to hell after 1971. Yeah, he thought that this might be another Great Depression, but the international monetary system did not collapse. It surprised him that it did not collapse. He really thought it would collapse, that there would be a rerun of the 30s, but it did not collapse. And the reason it did not collapse was because already the offshore dollar system, the euro bond market, the euro dollar market had already gotten going because of all of the capital controls in the US in the 1960s. And that's what took over the leadership of the expansion of the dollar system. And then Volcker came in 79, and then the Plaza Accord in 85. He thought that sort of put the dollar system back together again for a while. That's exactly the subtext of his presidential address, that he thinks that here's a chance for US leadership again on the back of the Plaza Agreement. It disappointed him. It didn't happen. But it's quite right. I tell that whole story about the 70s in the book. And maybe I will just stop there. The book is only 260 pages, but it is, it's dense, I'm afraid. And the footnotes are on the same page as the text, so that you can read, if you want to investigate things, you can go down to the footnotes and follow up with the readings. I tried to keep it short, and that's why it's there. But there are many spin-offs to come. I think I will be giving talks on this book for the next couple of years.
Nice. I think we have about time for one or two more questions, but I can already assure you the liquidity happy hour is there. And I think we, as Perry said, will draw on these conversations and invite Tom and Anastasia and anybody that's interested for follow-up conversations in the next weeks and months, because we will not do justice to any of the issues raised here in the next minute or two. But I see Anush has his hand up, so please go ahead.
Thanks, Jay. Thanks, Perry. I'm the liquidity happy hour last is going to be a little too late for me, so I'm going to take the opportunity to jump in. Perry, thanks for that lovely talk and for the comments as well. One question: why empire? As a post-colonial, I have a particular relationship to that term. Of course, Americans are post-colonials as well. It strikes me that Charlie wants to say, precisely as you said, global public goods without the world state. And that's what he means by empire. But I'm not sure everyone will read it like that, especially if it's in the title. And I think he obviously is a kind of intelligence analyst, but I think perhaps there's in fact two versions of empire going on, and he's pitching for his version of empire. His strikes me that his is an empire of trade and investment, backstopped by leadership. But what we actually ended up getting is Fisher Black's empire, an empire of finance. His is an empire where most FDI goes to the global south, a world of capital controls, where you have a buyer and a sort of buyer of last resort, an importer of last resort, and a lender of last resort. What we got was an empire of finance, no capital controls, one big destabilizer as opposed to one big stabilizer. That destabilizer ends up cleaning up its own mess some of the time. But FDI is flowing upstream to mainly to the global north. If we look at the main recipients of FDI, China, of course, is an outlier in there. So de Cecco's empire is more the latter empire, it strikes me, the empire of finance, with Britain as and the city as the center. But that's not Charlie's empire. Charlie's is an empire of another kind of empire. So first, it may be empire as a term, but also it's I'm not in empire entails coercion, of course, right? And there is, of course, an entire tradition of looking at not just hegemonic stability, but American informal empire post-war and so on and so forth. So that's not really a question, but just, I suppose, is empire is the most economical way of saying global public goods without world government. But also, I just want to recognize that is a very particular version of versus what we got. But that's all by way of comment, I guess.
Well, this is throughout the book, and it's meant to reference the British Empire, the replacement, and in fact, explicitly to reference Marcello Di Cecco's book, Money and Empire, and that this is a different kind of empire. The American empire is a different kind of empire than the British Empire. That it's a more decentralized one. It's a less, but it's nonetheless it has a quality like that. There's a number of footnotes that you'll be interested in, okay, in how Charlie was they tried to recruit him for this in 1960. McCloy, when MIT went to Washington, Kindleberger did not go to Washington. Okay, he stayed at MIT. Okay, and he could have gone to Washington. He did get his security clearance back. Okay, but he didn't want to be part of the imperial political project. Actually. And I think the second thing is that he definitely thought that getting the global South access to the global capital markets, private capital markets, was the answer. So that you needed to do that. The kind of thing that's happened only in the last 10 years, really, where the global champions of the global South are all borrowing in dollars, easily. And why? Because interest rates are zero in the global North. He would have viewed that as finally, but it raises new problems of instability and of debt repayment, and that's all happening now. But that's part of that Darwinian evolution that he would have seen. So I don't know that he's so far from Di Cecco and or even Fisher Black as you might think, because private capital was for the answer. I think I want to stop right now because we need to leave room. But let's do. I wanted to answer you because you're not going to be here for the liquidity happy hour. But we can chat. We can chat more. Okay.